Welcome to the Streets and People podcast presented by Get Around Cabo Car Free. Get Around Cabo Car Free is a volunteer community movement advocating for more transport options for people who can't drive in Caboolture and Morayfield in Queensland. In today's podcast, we'll be covering one of these three broad topics. It might be Road Rules 360, where we discuss Queensland's road rules, the legislation, the design for people walking, biking, in wheelchairs or on a scooter. It might be Not Everyone Drives, where we chat with people whose transport options don't include a car in a car-dependent society. And it might be People and Projects, where our conversations are with people working on a specific aspect of inclusive transportation. Today we're doing one of our People and Projects episodes. I'm here on Gubbi Gubbi country in Caboolture in Queensland, and I am lucky enough to have Dr. Anthony Kimpton. I know Dr. Kimpton through Better Streets, which is an organisation which a few of us are involved with, and you're in Queensland as well, in Toowoomba, is that correct?
I'm calling from the Ipswich region, so this is the Yagara and Europol people.
As I said, I know you because we're both on Better Streets. I don't really know much more about what you do other than you're a lecturer at the University of Southern Queensland, and it's something to do with transport and data. So perhaps you could mention what it is that you do and how it is that you became interested in that area.
Absolutely. I was actually studying sociology, and I was always very interested in how people use the built environment, how they interact, how populations flow across cities. So over time, I developed a lot more expertise with GIS, which pretty much led me into planning because planning is really applied sociology. Initially, I was very much focused on crime in public spaces. We have this area called crime prevention through environmental design. I could see how this could really influence, for instance, how inclusive our built environment is for our community. So particularly if you're from a vulnerable community, a particular social group that feels less safe in the environment, this could have lots of consequences for you, such as your social networks, your traffic modes that are available to you. If you feel unsafe, more inclined to drive, and this has a personal expense to households. So all of this interests me, and over time I could see that we're progressing essentially down the wrong path all this time. We've been developing cities very much around cars, and quite frankly, it's not sustainable. It's very expensive to design and maintain these roads and build at this scale. We're increasingly looking at new ways that we can mix land use much more so that walking and cycling is much more viable. And this also is very important for us to increase our physical activity. As a country, Australia is going backwards from these Heart Foundation recommendations for daily activity. They're not actually very high targets. I think it's around about 30 minutes per day, but we're just not actually meeting those targets. So it seems like a very effective way that we can actually improve public health. And there's been lots of studies that have looked at this and demonstrate the huge impacts it's going to have for our society by increasing physical activity in terms of quality years of life, so our capacity to remain working, for instance, also in terms of the reduces on healthcare expenditure. So it just seems like it's a very important space to work to me. I've made it my priority in terms of research.
And just to clarify, what is GIS?
If you think of, for instance, Google Maps, this is a geographical information science system. So that's what it stands for. Or sometimes it's also geographical information science. It's a little bit confusing, but we're always referring to the same sort of idea. So if you think in the past, we had static sort of printed maps. Now we have more interactive digital maps, and there's lots of advantages. So we can switch off and on layers, and we can also design these tools to examine a lot of spatial relationships. Thinking of, for instance, the Google Maps example, you can ask it to route you from one location to another, and it will calculate, for instance, all the public transport you need, how long it's going to likely take, what is the sort of traffic you're likely to encounter. That's an example, but there's lots of them. Particularly in planning, the public, for instance, can look at all the zoning maps, and these are quite often through an interactive GIS system, so a web-based GIS is what we call it. It's come a long way, and if you think, a lot of the people that are working council today talk about back when they used to use printed maps, and you could tell what were the controversial areas in a town because it was the bumpy part on the map where they had to keep sticking new layers on, whereas now it's much more digital and more informative. There's a lot more information that's all overlaid at the same scale. So it's a huge, I guess, development that we tend to overlook.
That's really good because I hear this term a lot, GIS. What I really like about having people on the show is that I'm always learning a huge amount and trying to understand, and it helps me to become better at doing what I do. So thank you very much for explaining that. You you are a lecturer, is that correct? So you teach university students, first year, second year, third year university students?
Most of my students are in their second and third year in terms of the classes I teach, and it's predominantly urban planning students, but we also have a lot of students from a couple of engineering schools. So you might have, say, a civil engineering background. We have a lot of surveyors as well within our school, and also construction managers. So it's a couple of different disciplines that are all very focused around the built environment.
And do you find that the students have come through urban planning, urban design, construction, or engineering? Do they come with a different idea? And when you read the work that, you obviously have to sit there and mark it, I presume. And when you read the assignments that come in, do you notice a difference in slant or way that they see the world?
Absolutely. I guess if I was going to typify, say, a planning student, they tend to be very excited about pulling in a lot of information from everywhere. Whereas I think a lot of other disciplines teach you to be very focused on the particular site. So we might give them a particular case study and they're more narrowly focused and detail orientated. We need all types of thinking. And that's why we design a lot of our assessments around group activities so they interact with other disciplines. It's really a core principle of how we design our coursework. We want it to resemble the real world. And so as a planner, you're quite often going to be in quite a central role of communicating between all these different disciplines. So it's a big part of how we design our coursework. They don't always have that immediate familiarity with, for instance, the GIS that we're just talking about, the geographical information systems. And so that's where it's a really fantastic opportunity for us to raise everyone's awareness of these tools, because we're at a point now where really what's interesting about it is we've got so much data being produced, big data, and it quite often has coordinates, which means that we can combine lots of different data sets. So we don't have to go out and do the same amount of primary data collection we did in the past, because it's already exceptional data with complete national coverage that we just didn't have previously, rather than going out at a collection on a smaller scale each time. That's what excited me personally, was just that I could link, say, land use from the ABS with, say, crime data from the Queensland Police Service and look at the association, which just wasn't possible previously.
So, ABS, Australian Bureau of Statistics, that's a government authority. I think most people would be familiar with that term, but just to clarify. And you said the word coordinates. Do you mean like the sort of latitude, longitude coordinates? So, I see those in Google Maps as well. Those are across the world. Is that right? Do they remain static always?
Yeah, so we have what's called a datum. It's essentially a reference point for all of these. And so it's largely like Greenwich, I think, in the UK, as you know, that point for 0 degrees. It's something that we can use. It's universal. And there's also lots of other tools that we use. So quite often we'll receive data that has, say, an address attached to it. And so what we do is we geocode this. There's essentially an online repository that will convert these addresses into coordinates and will give us the location that's in the middle of that address. That's how we can combine lots of different data sources in novel ways.
This is so cool. I really love this. Thank you very much for sharing. And what are you working at the moment? So you have some new students, is that right? Or do you have students that are partway along? And what is the role of a supervisor with a PhD student? How does that work?
Yeah, so we take on multiple roles really when you've got an academic position. So a large component is teaching undergraduate students. So they're working towards their degree. Typically, I'll be focused on students that are getting into planning. So this is an area that we have as a national skills shortage at the moment. So it's very important to get lots of planners out there. In contrast, we also have a role where we might have honours students. So typically, if you're doing honours, that's a 1 year degree that kind of extends your undergraduate degree. And this is where you get to work more directly with a researcher. For me personally, this is really what got me started in research. I found it amazing to have direct supervision from two academics. You just don't get that sort of mentorship generally when you're part of a larger class. So I think it's a really high value activity. I really appreciate that guidance I received as an honours student. Then beyond that, you have the option to potentially be a master's student. This is where you really get to more choose your project. So I always tell students that honours is almost like a sprint, whereas masters and PhD are more like an endurance race where you've got to spend a greater amount of time and really dig deep into the subject. But really the expectation when students go into masters or a PhD program is that they're going to become global experts in a particular field. It's a period of time where they really get to focus on a particular topic that they're passionate about and really build knowledge for the international research community in that space. As a supervisor, it's not like what you might have encountered previously where we're passing on knowledge. Instead, it's more like coaching where we're trying to make sure that they can navigate these vast literatures, because the research literature, I don't have the exact figures in front of me, but I think it was about every 5 years it doubles these days. And that's because we've got these global repositories where everyone's building on each other's research. So there's just so much to sift through each time. And so our role is really to pass on some of our expertise of sifting through all this information so they can have the most authoritative research within that time frame. That's how I see it. But in terms of the topics, it's largely we let them choose the topic. I've got one PhD candidate that's looking at heritage management around Ipswich. So looking at residential houses and how we tend to prioritise all the largest residential houses, but we don't put the same sort of protections in place for, like, for instance, a workers' cottage, which is actually a better representation of the community at that time. So that's one example. I've got another PhD that would be great to get on here at one point that is looking specifically at road traffic stress around schools. And so this is, again, another way that we can increase physical activity amongst school children by making it more viable for them to safely cycle or walk to school. So we're largely looking at the social equity around this, also the barriers and facilitators essentially within the community that encourage whether people use active transport or whether parents are more inclined to drop their kids at school. So that's another example. And then I've got another student that looks at just policy throughout Australia, so land use policy, and to some extent also the state level transport policy, and looking at how this supports active communities, so making communities, again, these spaces for where it's viable to move around by active transport. It's more of a policy focus. So that's what I mean, where it's really up to the PhD and where they want to deepen their expertise. I have, one student's looking at essentially assessments and protections in communities, another one that's looking more empirically and gathering primary data, and then a third one that's really taking a deep dive into national policy to see how we can learn from different community contexts around Australia.
Policy, that would be those government documents you might see, so for instance, a strategy document or policy documents. You see these because they look quite indigestible. Sometimes I review them just with the council. I just have to sit there and try and break my brain because they feel quite impenetrable, although it's ostensibly written in plain English. Often it feels quite opaque. I wonder how much there is awareness that the community wants to read these documents, or whether it's only for the professionals who are working in policy.
I think there's multiple components to that. I think a large part of what we're encountering, so let's say a land use plan is one of these policy documents. It's actually a little bit of a messy area, a bit like, a lot of legal areas where we have lots of terms for the same ideas. But generally, the strategies are more like guidelines, whereas the plans are a lot more legalistic. So it would have, for instance, minimum standards. Having a bus stop within 400 meters of your home might be an example. A lot of that is all tabulated and it's quite heavy reading, and it's not really intended to be read. It's more of something that you go through, locate specific information. The intent really with a lot of these plans, these minimum standards, are really to be read from people in the areas. So it could be a land use developer, it could be a planner that they've hired from a commercial firm that's ensuring that the development application meets the expectations for the council. In terms of the general process, these development applications are then reviewed in council by a lot of planners, and they essentially provide their recommendations, and this is potentially going to go ahead of either the general manager or our elected representatives. So if you think of a councillor or the mayor, they're the people that actually make the decisions on a lot of this development. So the planner's role is really just to put all the information together that they need for their decision making. It is quite complex information. Believe it or not, Queensland is actually one of the easier places in Australia for this. We have what's called a state planning policy that somewhat standardizes our plans here because they're shaped around the same general sort of thematic chapters. Whereas if you go to other states, particularly New South Wales is a tough one, it varies considerably between every local government area, which makes it very challenging at times to even just compare different contexts. And the other distinction really with Queensland is we have this history of amalgamations of local governments. So Brisbane City Council and Gold Coast City Council are very large councils, and they're close to 10 times the size of the other ones. So if you think of, say, the Sydney metropolitan region, I think it's around 30 local governments, lots of different councils all trying to coordinate with very different planning documentation. We're actually in the lucky state with this, I think.
That's very useful information. I had no idea about any of that, so thank you very much. I know it's a little bit away from your research area, but it's just great to know this sort of information. So speaking about your research areas, what is it that is your really big thing that you're super curious now about, perhaps extending your own journey of understanding and perhaps bringing along some of the students with you?
One of my main focuses at the moment, if we circle back to that geospatial information systems, is I'm developing what we call participatory geospatial information systems, or PGIS. Sorry, we use a lot of acronyms because these words are too long. I guess the key point of this is typically if you're using something such as Google Maps, there's a lot of information already stored in there that you can explore. We're designing these in a way that it can accept more input from community stakeholders. So it creates a space for them to identify particular locations that are barriers or good enabling infrastructure within their community for whatever purpose. So we're designing in such a way that it can support a lot of projects and advocacy groups, particularly in the active transport space. I guess one of the shortcomings of these sorts of platforms in the past is they gather a lot of data. So you'll encounter lots of these maps, have lots of pins in the maps, but it's kind of passive at that point where it doesn't really take it to council. Council is just presented essentially with a huge map full of pins, and it's hard to know what to do with all that information. So we're designing it in such a way that members from the community can draw out a lot of this information and summarize it, produce very professional looking figures, and then write a letter of concern to their local councillors. So we're trying to enhance their capacity to provide the information to the councillors and get that conversation going in the first place. So we see this as a way to transform communities more into that sort of active living sort of space where they're less auto dependent.
Yeah, that's very interesting because I'm obviously very engaged in the space. One of the things that I've discovered is that if I go to my local councillor, my local state MP, and my local federal member of parliament, as I arrive there, and I try and explain something, they're all good people. Some of them are more receptive, but some of them, their eyes glaze over and I become that difficult, noisy person, or I become that difficult, noisy person to counsel. With that report, does that make it more neutral? Because how will you keep down the numbers of those reports, I guess?
Absolutely. It's interesting that you mentioned that because part of the way we're designing this is so that members of the community can identify other people that share a similar sort of outlook and are providing similar information so that they can essentially aggregate their letters of concern into one letter. We want to also design this in such a way that it's just sent such a strong case that it's too difficult for councillors and mayors to ignore because of the quality of the information. I think it's really about helping also councils to know which areas to prioritise, which ones are hurting. We include a lot of layers where you can look at, for instance, the cyclability or walkability throughout the community so that you can see how it stacks to help with prioritizing particular areas. And this has really always been my sort of area, is trying to reduce the expertise barrier with using a lot of these tools, because in essence, a planner is someone that represents the interests of the community, also commercial interests, government interests. We've got to try and take them all into account. Everybody's interests are equally valid in this. So we just need to actually make sure that we can properly engage the public and don't make it too arduous for them to do this effectively.
I guess my question in that, and perhaps I shouldn't be asking this, but I'm going to ask it, how receptive would council be to receiving these kinds of letters and reports? My observation, now that I have a bit to do with interfacing with different government departments, is that some people are receptive, but a lot of people, they go in, they have a career, so they're looking to advance their career, and that is about looking good in the internal world, inside the council. And then you've got this pesky person on the outside who says, actually, I want something different. And that might interrupt. Well, that's not what I want to do. And there are a lot of people, what do you call it, backyard lawyers or something, where people are gaining a lot of information, maybe taking up a lot of time. Then it's like, we need another barrier to shut down because there's so much noise. We're receiving so much noise in legal courts. This is a problem because some people are rambling on and on and on, and it's causing problems. So how will that not become a problem where people in council, it interrupts their own sense of ambition? Ostensibly they're serving the community, but well, you're serving yourself and you're serving the community, and if push comes to shove, you're going to be serving yourself in an ambitious person. Not everybody is equally ambitious and not everyone is equally community minded. How to balance that?
I guess that speaks to a much larger problem than what we can tackle in terms of, for instance, risk aversion within councils, where it's quite often safer to do nothing than take a chance, no matter how remote, and potentially make the situation the same despite all the spending, or potentially worse. There's definitely a lot of international research that demonstrates why, for instance, we would want to design more active communities rather than prioritizing cars. One of the things that we can really do to make this more effective is they quite often need to prioritize economic development in areas. It's also linking together lots of the data sets that can strengthen their case for how it's going to benefit the community by reducing costs elsewhere. That's one of the key components, and it kind of aligns a little bit with a part of my previous role. So prior to coming to the University of Southern Queensland, I was working at the Australian Bureau of Statistics, where one of my roles was actually to combine a lot of big data sources. So data from federal government, a lot of state governments. It could relate to healthcare. It's linking the census, everything at the individual level, and building new data sets. And I think we just have so much capacity for that, for really strengthening the business case that they need in their role. They want to know where they can most effectively direct their time. And another part of how we're designing this is we know which are the tiers of government that different letters of concern have got to go to. And so we're designing in such a way that it's addressed to the key people, because I don't think there's always a lot of clarity about, should I send this to a state member? Is it a federal issue? Is it local council? More often than not, it's going to be local council. Quite often, local government doesn't have to toe the same party line as they do at the higher tiers of government. I think we're not as powerless as we think in terms of the council, and they're actually much more approachable than the general public realizes. And the other thing to think of when we're talking about particularly land use and transport planning is it's quite often the domain of state government, but we do have local roads where the local council can influence this. So it's just making sure that we can do this in such a way that we can pull out the information and say, okay, well, they're actually got an inquiry about a state road, so this should be addressed to their state member. It's all part of our general design, and we've got a lot of experienced planners working with us. The other part of this is we're co-designing it with members of the community, so different transport and walking advocacy groups, to make sure that it fits how everybody else has been approaching this. My sense in this space is there's a little bit of fatigue, particularly amongst advocacy groups, where they've been providing all this information for some time and it goes nowhere. We've got all these lovely web geographical information systems full of pins. You click the button, you get the text field, and it says what they were unhappy about. But we don't even know from looking at these whether the council has addressed it. So we actually want to see the wins as well on these dashboards and say, okay, this was brought to the council's attention and they've addressed it, and we can see all the wins on the dashboard. We need to do this to really up public engagement, so we don't just feel like that we're, screaming into the dark essentially. So we have all the tools to do this, and it is challenging circumstances too. As far as a OECD country, we do have a very low spending on research in Australia too. So it's very challenging for us to develop these tools as fast as we would like.
I think it sounds like a wonderful product, and I certainly would be interested in it. Is it something that I could afford? I don't have a huge income. This is kind of what I do, I guess. Will it be a huge paywall or anything like that for me to be able to enter?
We're designing in such a way so that there are some similar services out there, but generally they have really high subscription fees. So we're talking about $30,000 a year, which is too much for a lot of advocacy groups, for instance. We're adopting a different approach where it's really pay by user, and this is like really small amounts so that it reduces the risk to organizations essentially, because they don't want to spend $30,000 and just have 10 really motivated people within their community that are using it and produce 200 pins, and then there's no more engagement after that. So it's more what we call software as a service approach, where you're paying by use, and that's really just to reduce those costs, because we really want high numbers of users. Unfortunately, it's not something we can completely do for free. So we could, for instance, freely post a lot of the information that's presented, but it does require a back-end sort of computer to gather a lot of this information, process it in such a way, and present it again. So that's our main overhead beyond the development cost, but we have the expertise to do that development. It's more a time thing.
And do you have a timeline about when you think this might be ready? And that's always a really difficult thing in software, because it just takes, you think, oh yeah, I'm nearly there. It's like writing an essay. I've just got the basics done. Now I'm just going to tweak it a little bit. And then it takes another, 1/3 of time.
We don't have a clear timeline, and it's really dependent always on grant funding, because that determines how many people we can hire for different tasks. We have submitted several grants for this. It's also something I'm working away at in the background. In terms of my background, I have done my time doing software development in that agile space where you design essentially a minimum viable product and keep iterating through co-design with your target sort of user group, so that you can keep progressing it and making incremental changes. And that's pretty much baked into our project. We intend to keep expanding this in new ways over time, and so we're designing it with this sort of core functionality and then adding on additional steps. Realistically, we'd have a minimum viable product out there within the year. At this point, it's still early stages, and like I said, we potentially have some wins with grant funding, then we can obviously accelerate this and also extend the functionality of the tool.
I must say, that sounds like that would be so much more efficient. I don't like the word efficient. It does feel like I'm sort of screaming into the dark often, because I don't know whether it's been received. Has it been acted on? It does feel after a while like, why would I bother if I keep writing and then I might get no, but I keep writing. After a while, I'm just going to feel worn down. I think it's a fantastic product. So thank you absolutely for putting it together, your idea, and bringing your expertise from the ABS. And I think that's going to be a worldwide hit, let's say. If we think about our listener, we might have a mum at home with a a couple of kids who's moved to a new area, doesn't really know anyone, isn't part of a group. If she were to do something, what would you suggest that she might be able to take action with?
I guess one of the best ways, if you're a parent, you want that greater capacity for your children to engage in physical activity and particularly active transport for schools, is really reaching out to a lot of the local advocacy groups, because they quite often have programs in place to support this. So I know, for instance, in Ipswich, something we're developing right now is, it goes by different names, but it's essentially what we call a cycle train, where we've got some police officers from the community cycling with kids to school and essentially building up a convoy behind them. And this sort of is a way that children can learn to cycle. This is a local initiative, and it also means over time then we've got older kids that have been doing it for a couple of years that know the cycling routes, and you build up this sort of community movements. There's lots of similar sorts of groups and initiatives around the country. I would recommend, for instance, going onto a lot of the websites of groups such as Queensland Walks is a good one that's very focused on walkability in communities, and also there's Bicycle Queensland is another big one that focuses more on the cycling side. So they have a lot of programs and they need everybody's support, and it's just a way that, you can quite often draw on a lot of expertise. I know for a lot of these groups, quite a few of them are ex-members of councils and state government that really wanted to do a lot more during their career, and now they're contributing their expertise within these advocacy groups. So they've got all this enthusiasm to change things, and they just need a lot more members of the community involved with these projects to really move the dial.
That's great. And say our listener is somebody who works in a council in the transport team. What would you suggest that they could do?
That's actually relates to something that we're developing at the moment at UniSQ. So we've been developing a lot of micro-credential courses. Our first ones have really been shaped around digital twinning, which overlaps to some degree. So digital twinning is where we might use, say, LiDAR. So that's like laser readers that measure distance. They might be on a stationary point where they create a 3D environment from a one point sort of perspective, or you might have some that you carry on your body and walk through, and it essentially scans the landscape. That's one area. We've got another one that's focused around drones. And then the one that I'm really looking to develop is around this sort of plan tech space, how you design digital tools, because quite often when you work in council, a lot of your role is very much shaped around assessing development applications, because the systems have become so complex in recent times. So that's getting a lot of priority, but we really want to see them capitalizing on a lot of these tools that have been available for some time. So I've taught courses around what we call multimodal routing, which isn't used enough. And this is a tool that is somewhat like Google Maps. It tells you how you get from point A to point B. It can assess a whole lot of different factors. So I mentioned road traffic stress earlier. It can calculate cyclist routes if they're trying to stick to a low stress route, and you can then look at how much time it adds onto your route cycling while trying to stay safe and not mix with fast moving traffic. Or it looks at the percentage of your trip that is on cycleways. So there's fantastic tools like this. They also look at public transport in a much more nuanced way. So you can look at how schedules vary throughout the day. I mentioned earlier about council minimum standards, how they might say you need a bus stop within 400 meters, but it doesn't tell us anything about when a bus is actually going to collect you from that bus stop. It doesn't tell you where the bus can take you. The tools that I'm developing, they're going to be embedded in this platform, but it's also for some separate projects, will tell you where you can reach by public transport from your home within, say, an hour. It's this broader sort of area of chrono-urbanism, we call it, and it's really about reimagining cities and towns in terms of travel time rather than distance. So we have the digital tools to do this, but we're still approaching in a bit of a naive way, just looking at distance. So 400 meters, for instance, doesn't tell us about what you had to cross along the way, for instance, or schedules. There's a lot in this space, and we really want to increase the expertise using a lot of these tools in councils, which is why we're designing these short courses for people who'd like to focus on a bit of personal development in these specific technologies.
I must say that bus one, because I'm very interested in bus services now because it's so bad here in Caboolture. Somebody who works in one of the big bus companies here says we're driving around buses full of air, and they don't want to be doing that, but that's sort of what they're left with for a range of reasons to do with all the different players and politics and costs and the way that costs are understood. So that's really great. So we're going to wrap up fairly soon, but just any last thoughts or suggestions, ideas, anything you would like to add to what you have already mentioned?
I guess the main thing I'd like to emphasize is it's actually very exciting times to be thinking about public transport. So we're just about to have a statewide trial where transit fares are going to be 50 cents, and we're going to potentially collect, a tremendous amount of data that will explain a lot more about transport behaviours, modal preferences, so in terms of when you choose your transport, and also the different routes people prefer, because just as we mentioned, the challenge that particular locations, we don't take into account, for instance, the wait times, and something that I have kind of written about a bit is what we call slack time. If you want to use public transport and say you're going into the Brisbane CBD, you might be so concerned about the inconsistencies of public transport that you arrive each day 30 minutes early just to make sure you arrive on time. So collectively as a society, this is kind of the trade-off of us using public transport. So we need better tools for this. In terms of the moving air sort of argument, this is quite often raised with public transport. There's lots of ways that we address this now. So I know there are counties in the US, for instance, where they were subsidizing Uber fares rather than paying for public transport, which meant that you could access it at any time of day. And it was actually much cheaper for the local authorities to provide this than actually pay for empty buses. There's a lot happening with this. There's also autonomous vehicles aren't such a distant idea anymore. This is going to greatly change how we navigate the cities. And the other big thing really for our region is we've got the Olympics on the horizon. So a huge time to transform our public transport. I truly hope that we capitalize on this opportunity and make something really special for our state so we can be recognized in this front as a global leader and a world city that tackles transport. I'm very excited personally that it's the right time to be involved with planning.
That's good to know. Yesterday I went into Brisbane. I had to get my e-bike fixed and I arrived there, as you say, 15 minutes before the train, just because I wanted to make sure that I got there on time. And then the train actually didn't come. So then I was waiting another half hour and I was late for my appointment. So these sorts of things don't do anybody any favors. It might seem like economy to keep it right down to the wire, but it becomes a false economy in a way because people stop using it when it becomes so unreliable. That's great. So I'm pleased to be in this space. Thank you very much. I'm really pleased about the conversation. So thank you very much for coming on the show, and I've really gotten a lot from it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Wendy. I really enjoyed chatting about all these topics that are very near and dear to my heart. So really appreciate it.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks for enjoying Streets and People, presented by Get Around Cabo Car Free. We publish our podcast regularly at the usual places and on our website, where you can find out more about us. getaroundcabocarfree.com.au. That's www.getaround, get around, that's pretty straightforward. Cabo, C-A-B-O, that's short for Caboolture. Car Free, C-A-R-F-R-E-E. There's no hyphen in that. .com.au. Our theme music is The Thief on AM Sound, which is just like our cars on our streets, always stealing the space. So let's stop that thief.